4 countries have already fired a ballistic missile from the surface of the Earth and hit one of their own satellites and blown them up to test. And, you know, they are not testing if they can blow any more of their own satellites up. No. They're testing something else. But the first country that puts a laser weapon on a satellite, every other country will do it for defensive purposes only. So that would massively raise the stakes, because then you're talking about not an amazing shot from Earth to kill a satellite, but just, you know, Wild West, lasers. I mean, I know it sounds like sci-fi, but that exists now.
Hello, Tim Marshall.
Hello to you. Thank you for the invitation to come here.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. We're here to talk about your new book,
Aye.
The Future of Geography. It's a follow-on from your geography series. It's a great book. I really enjoyed everything about it. Before we get into it, could you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Name's Tim Marshall. Was a full-time journalist, don't hate me. I was a foreign correspondent for many, many years, probably 1 or 2 too many. And I quit that world about 7 years ago and started trying to use the knowledge and experience to write about international relations, but I approach it from often a geographic underpinning. Wrote a book called Power of Geography. It did quite well, and it's a good template. You know, we're not talking art here, we're talking craft. So I've used that template and I've now moved it up to space.
What was the impetus for that? When people talk about international relations, it's very much sub-atmospheric.
Yeah.
No one. Well, genuinely, this is the first time I've ever thought about the politics of space, and it's fascinating.
Yeah.
What was the
well,
impetus?
it's because it has moved there, and the moment I realised it, I mean, it was blindingly obvious, but you know, you don't always see what's blindingly obvious. It's just, yeah, well, I write about international relations. International relations is clearly encompasses space now, so write about that. And then the more I did the research, the more I realised how now this is, because it encompasses politics, international relations, nation state, history, geography, warfare, and commerce. I mean, you know, the whole thing has come together in space.
What I found surprising in the book, what I think most people will find shocking, is that the global superpowers, it's not going to be the next 50 years that they go to space. It's in the next 10.
Yeah. The next 3, because in 2026, the Artemis Accords, led by the US, Britain is a member of that, and the Americans aim to put a man and a woman, they stipulated man and a woman, walking on the moon, 2026. And that is all part of a bigger process to get a moon base by the early 2030s. China, with Russia as its junior partner, is working on a similar time frame. So you can see these 2 blocks are moving, and they mirror the blocks to a great extent on Earth. And after that, the idea is you get to Mars via the moon. And it's driven by 3 things. One is the romantic side, which is that restless human spirit of discovery. And the second one is that thing that's gone in parallel with that throughout our history, which is rapacious greed, in part. No, it's driven a lot by commerce, because there are a lot of minerals on the moon and the asteroids, which we need actually for some of the renewable technology here. But also, the military aspect, you can't fight a modern war without access to space. And therefore all the major nations know they have to have a presence in space to be relevant, I'm afraid.
You touched there on the commerce side. What is there in space that could be commercialised?
Well, the satellites, obviously, and that is a massive growth industry. There's already about 8,000 working satellites, but Musk alone intends to put 10,000 up this decade. The Chinese are going to put another 10,000 up. There's loads of small companies. Britain is actually quite a senior player in satellites. So there's that. And then if you talk about asteroids, there's the rare earth metals that are on them. And then on the moon, you have got lithium, you've got silicon, basically most of the metals that we need here for the renewables, for the renewable technology of the 21st century. And you've got tens of millions of gallons of water, and in the water is hydrogen and oxygen and helium-3, which is a potential new other power source. So it's all there. The economic modelling is uncertain, but no one's going to risk missing out, and so there is something of an early Klondike gold rush going on.
That's what I find interesting about this. Is it seems like the Wild West at the moment.
Yeah.
There's no rules, and the rules that we do have the space seem utterly unfit for purpose. It reminds me of the Coke ad. Like, I'd like to buy a world of Coke. We can all share space, and space is nobody's. But
yeah,
it's been overtaken by.
I think so. I mean, that was the Coke ad. Is the sort of that is actually from pretty much the same time as the rules of the road were written, the mid to late 60s, and the Outer Space Treaty 1967, where it stipulates very clearly space is for all humanity. There is no sovereignty. You cannot claim sovereignty. But it's the words are still there, but the treaty is completely out of date, and the emotions behind it are being pushed to one side in a race to get these precious resources, both at a state level and a major private enterprise level. So I argue in the book we really need a new space treaty for a bunch of things. One, to try to reaffirm this idea that there's no sovereignty, to get some sort of sharing mechanisms put in, but the rules of the road about how long can you have an area for to exploit it, how close can one satellite be to another satellite, what are we going to do as a planetary species about space debris, which is a massive problem. And we just don't have these rules, and given that it's going to get more crowded and busier and more competitive, there's an urgent need for new 21st century treaties. What
is the current state of geopolitics, and how does that interlink with space? I suppose that's a very big, broad question.
But it's bang on, because there is this mirroring of it. So we have this American-led bloc still on Earth, and then we have, I would argue, a bloc of authoritarian states. Now, China is by far the biggest authoritarian state. Russia is now its junior partner, and they are pulling into their orbit, no pun intended, countries such as Nicaragua, authoritarian leader, Belarus obviously, Eritrea, Iran, and they're trying to get them into their space bloc, because the Americans won't allow Russia and China to cooperate anymore, which I think at a scientific level is a shame, but I understand it. So just as on Earth you have these blocks, the authoritarian bloc, the American-led bloc, it is being mirrored up there. And that's why, although I argue for a space treaty, I doubt we'll get one until we're several more years into this. Because if you go back to the 1940s, once we became aware that the nuclear war was a thing, it took years for them to get around the table to reduce the tensions between them. We'll probably have to go through a similar process in space.
So we'll have to get closer and closer to an active space war until they realise.
And there's all sorts of reasons why. For example, one satellite getting too close to another satellite, because satellites are an integral part of our critical infrastructure now, just as much as pipelines and water supplies are. And they're also, nuclear early warning systems are inside the satellites. So if there's an attack on a satellite, it's going to be taken pretty seriously. And there's already tests. 4 countries have already fired a ballistic missile from the surface of the Earth and hit one of their own satellites and blown them up to test. They are not testing if they can blow any more of their own satellites up.
No.
They're testing something else. So I'm not saying we're about to go to war in space. We're not. But that danger is now there. So back to the rules of the road.
You lay out a few hypothetical examples of how geopolitics in space, consequences of actions, could lead to a real escalation, it kind of read like science fiction. There's an example you gave about the Russians landing their lunar module too close to Britain's, and the whole thing's. I read it and I thought this just reads like science fiction, but it's...
Yeah, but doesn't it also, I hope simultaneously, it reads like something that if it wasn't for the space tech, could happen on Earth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'm quite old, and I was in Kosovo when the Russian forces rolled in, and they got in there because 12 hours before NATO arrived at Pristina Airport, and I was at Pristina Airport, and the Russians had lined up their armoured column, and an American general, Wesley Clark, ordered the British tip of the spear go through them. And the British general said, I'm not going to start effing World War III for you. And we didn't go through them. Now, it may not have been World War III, but so there's something that happened in the recent history. So I've taken that sort of episode and stuck it on the moon in 30 years. And in that scenario, it's just that the British, and I need to add here, the Artemis Accords, one of the accords is that you can declare a safety zone. I can understand that. You've put millions into getting there, researching where to dig and mining. And then someone who hasn't done any of that just rocks up next to you and gets their shovel out. So you have a safety zone in which, you know, it's safer if nobody else is there. Tell me what law you're going to quote. So in this pretend scenario, Russians are coming in and the Brits have blocked the landing zone and it all goes horribly wrong and there's a bit of a kerfuffle before China rings up and the UN sorts it all out. So it was just, I just wanted to portray that all these things have always happened here. Why wouldn't they happen there as well? So again, I mean, I keep coming back to it. Please, let's get rules of the road. Obviously,
The key comparison, I suppose, or an obvious comparison, is the 60s space race between Russia and the US. But I suppose a key difference is they didn't have private commercial actors.
That's a massive difference. You've read this book, haven't you? I can tell.
Yeah, you can tell. Yes, loved it.
God bless you. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right to pick that out, because I argue, and I think it's pretty obvious, the space race in the 60s, especially getting to the moon, was about ideology. One system having to prove we are superior. Our political system, our commercial system, our scientists, our educational system. And the Russians were 2-0 up. They got the first satellite up, Sputnik. They got the first person in space, Gagarin. And then Kennedy said, we have to do this by the end of the decade, first on the moon. And they made it. And it was for ideological reasons, because when humanity had a sort of fork in the road of which system you're going to choose. Very different now. It's far more now about the commercial aspect of the potential, incredible profits to be made, incredible amounts of the raw materials that we need, that we can get, and then the military aspect. And private enterprises absolutely, completely enmeshed in this. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, it was a sort of sideshow to the state. The state is still big, but what is very new is the degree to which private enterprise is inside this.
You mentioned Elon Musk quite a lot in the book. What do you make of Elon Musk?
I think he's a revolutionary genius. I think he's odd. I think he's a libertarian at heart, which has good and bad points in it. I do like his quip that he wants to die on Mars, just not on impact. If you're referring to the freedom of speech and the Twitter stuff, I confess I haven't followed it as closely as I perhaps should have.
I actually more meant in terms of SpaceX.
Oh, well, no, in SpaceX, a lot of this could not have happened without him. He's massively reduced the costs. He looked up one day at one of his rockets falling back to Earth, you know, which was going to be destroyed, and he thought, why am I throwing away $400,000 or whatever it was? And he pioneered this reusable rockets, you know. You've massively reduced the costs. At the same time as the militarisation, the Israelis are one of the pioneers of this. And as an aside, nearly everybody launches west to east to take advantage of the rotation of the Earth to get a bit of extra speed. If you look at a map, there's a problem if Israel launches a rocket west to east. So they launched it the other way, which caught more fuel. So they thought, so they were one of the pioneers of militarizing satellites, and they're now as small as a Rubik's Cube, some of them, or a shoebox. So you can now get a constellation of like 20 satellites up as the part load of one rocket, which is going to come back anyway, as opposed to a one-shot rocket with a fridge freezer-sized satellite in it. So Musk and others are massively behind this incredible reduction, which is why there's 80 countries in space now.
Which just seems mind-boggling when you think back to the 60s when it was just the US and
the Russians.
They're just slogging it out.
Yeah. Well, the Brits had some satellites, one or two others, I think the Italians. But yeah, it was a handful of satellites. And now, as I said, there's 80 countries. Nigeria makes its own satellites. Lots of countries do. There are 8,000 working satellites. Musk's going to put 10,000 more. The Chinese 10,000 more. The Italians are putting them up. I mean, it's going to get crowded. Luckily, it's quite a big place.
What's the worst case scenario for for space being politicized?
Oh, it's inevitable. Well, it is, and it will continue to be. The worst case scenario is there's one country deciding it will arm its satellites. As I said, there's already been these tests to kill a satellite with a missile from Earth. They work. There's now the technology to take a drone out with a laser beam. It costs about $1 of electricity. The missiles the Ukrainians are firing at the Russian drones that are coming in, they cost sometimes $250,000. So I'm pretty confident I know which direction anti-drone warfare will go. $1 shot, thank you. It's very easy to put those on satellites. Now, nobody has, God willing, nobody will. But the first country that puts a laser weapon on a satellite, every other country will do it for defensive purposes only. So that would massively raise the stakes, because then you're talking about not an amazing shot from Earth to kill a satellite, but just, Wild West, lasers. I mean, I know it sounds like sci-fi, but that exists now. That's a major problem, because then there would be these increased tensions and an increased arms race. The other one, though, isn't actually really to do with politics. It's the Kessler syndrome. NASA scientist in the 60s, Kessler, came up with this scenario. You seen the film Gravity?
Yes.
This is where they got the plot from. One satellite hits another, and at that speed they're going, it's like water. They just pass through each other, and then there's thousands of bits of metal. And they go around at 300,000 miles an hour and hit another one, and another one, and another one, cascade, until all you've got around the Earth is a belt of debris. You can't launch any more satellites. No more satellites, don't bother calling Uber or Sainsbury or anything else you want to do, because the economies will collapse.
Or traversing the seas, or having a military campaign, or
the whole thing.
Anything.
Because they are now integral into modern life.
It's quite fascinating how kind of precarious it is.
Yeah, but technology has always been like that, and we've always been frightened of it. I mean, I've got one of the analogies I use, it's stretching it, the Gutenberg press. What a fantastic advancement in humanity's knowledge. But a few years after it came out, there were so many books proving that women were witches. Burn them, which happened. The Gutenberg press was part of the process. Hundreds of women being burnt to death. Absolutely terrible. But you're not looking back through history and thinking, well, it should never have happened. There are always these negative signs that we have to learn and go through before we try to harness them.
Now imagine, but the woman being burned at the stake would have been like, I wish that press hadn't been.
No, well, they would have, yeah.
Then conversely, what's the ideal situation?
Well, that we rapidly approach very good binding treaties, that we recognise as a species that cooperation is the way ahead, and that the stuff we get is used for the benefit of humanity. And there is a possibility of this. I mean, the medical experiments that are going on in space are amazing and will benefit us all. There are scenarios a few years out, fields of solar panels in space, because they can deflect the sun's solar energy down 24/7, because there's no night and day up there. Therefore, you can put the solar into the fields of receivers on Earth, and it can then feed out straight into the grid, because one of the problems at the moment is that we haven't invented the batteries that can store the power. So they soak it all up. Well, they don't soak it up. They get the sun's rays and put it straight out. It's like a solar panel if you got one on your house. Soaks it, receives it, powers your house. The moment it goes dark, it goes dark. But because we haven't got the batteries, it's coming down all the time. It's not dark. You're getting the energy. So there are many very positive things. I mean, there's a strong argument, don't bother with it all. We've got too many problems here. I don't think I think they're complementary, not contradictory. I think we can try and sort stuff here, and we can try and make sure that what's going on there is part of that process. Am I optimistic? Always.
Well, that's good to hear, but maybe I'm just less optimistic. It reminds me of, the film Don't Look Up, where
that's great fun.
Humanity comes together to deflect the asteroid, but one billionaire realizes he can mine the asteroid, so don't destroy it. In my head, that's a lot more feasible.
Yeah, it's a fun film, isn't it? Well, yeah, they use the conceit of this massive thing that's getting closer in order to make fun of popular culture and its obsession, and the media, its obsession with froth, and it's a justifiable vehicle. I love the end scene. But 2 years ago, there was a multi-nation effort, and it worked. It was called DART. We sent a missile. We sent a rocket up with something on the head, and we hit an asteroid that was revolving around another asteroid. It was a big asteroid and a little asteroid, and we hit, and it's 100 million miles away or something. We hit it and deflected it off course. It wasn't going to hit Earth. We were just testing, and the test was complete. We have proved we can deflect an asteroid. So we are aware of these problems, and some people are working to solve them, because that's a planet-ending scenario, the asteroid scenario, and solar flares is a real issue. There was one in the 70s that knocked out the grid in Canada for 2 days. Every light bulb, every fridge, every traffic light, and people are working on how to mitigate against that. So, there's a lot of good stuff going on. But you're in journalism. When I was in TV, we used to have this phrase that we don't film houses not burning down. You film houses burning down. And I think we should do more to let the audience know that this is not a snapshot of the world, actually. This is a snapshot of the houses that are burning down. Everywhere else, most of the time, it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Less interesting TV, though, to be fair.
Yeah, but I think we need to make sure that people are aware that this is not the world. This is a part of it.
You make the point in your book that humans throughout, since the beginning of time, have thought about space and examined space. And you make the point that things will happen in space, and there'll be technologies that we can't begin to comprehend. It'd be like, I think you used the analogy, it'd be like a fish imagining fire.
That's Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, excuse me.
He said we've got about as much concept of what might come as a fish understands electricity.
Well, I'm going to ask you to be that fish.
Yeah.
Say we were having, say in 10 years' time, we have this conversation again. What do you think what is space like then?
In 10 years is actually quite easy.
Okay.
No, really, in 10 years there's probably laser-armed satellites. There'll be bodyguard satellites to get in the way of other satellites. There'll be an increased integration between warfare and space. There'll probably be a space station. The Artemis Accords plan a space station. The Chinese will have an even bigger one. The beginnings of the moon bases will be there. So, we're talking 2033. And there will be some advances that I can't. But if you're talking about 100 years, then you can just let your imagination run riot. Because I didn't put this in the book, but and I don't even know if this story is true, but it serves as an analogy. Apparently, at the same time as the first cars were coming out, there was a particular car manufacturer who built his prototype and was asked, how many are you going to make? And he said, about 10,000. Why so few when there's so many of us? He said, I don't think there's that many chauffeurs that could be employed. Because his concept was, if you can afford a car, you're obviously quite well off. All the well-off people that have got horse and carts, they've got someone who rides it for them. So he couldn't make that leap. So there's going to be things that are invented that we won't know the ramifications of them until then we look back and think, oh yeah. I mean, we do it all the time on Earth, all the time. You know, your generation, for example, mobile phones. Now, they were actually relatively new, but it was just normal. You know, and these things just become normal, even though they're actually straight out of Star Trek, as far as I'm concerned.
My final question for you, geopolitics, back on Earth, are you hopeful about it?
I'm sanguine. I don't want to quote too much of the Bible here, but there's Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. I think that's quite useful to think that. I mean, yeah, obviously there's new stuff, you know, there's inventions, but the point is that we've seen a version of it before. So every generation, and as they get older, say, oh, it's not like it used to be. Yeah, of course it isn't. That was then and this is now, and it's usually better now. So, you know, we're going through a very difficult, very bumpy period. We're back into great power politics. And we've come out of the end of the Cold War into what I wrote then, this is a holiday from history. This is not normal, this peace and love and joy and prosperity. This is a holiday from history. War in Europe, which was unthinkable. No, it's very thinkable. So it's actually not that different. So, I mean, this is very contested, but Steven Pinker wrote a book, The Better Side of Our Nature, and he puts a lot of stats in showing how humanity is pretty much been on the upward scale for 400 years. I subscribe to that. Now, you can give me a million reasons why it's awful, a million reasons of suffering and poverty, but I actually think the metrics suggest humanity is getting better. There's less absolute poverty, there's medical breakthroughs, and I know I would much rather be alive now than 200 or 300 years ago. So on that, I'm actually quite positive, and we will come out of this incredibly difficult multilateral world, and we'll carry on. I would just advise people understand it, study it or whatever, but don't worry about it, because what's that going to do?
On that hopeful note, Tim Marshall, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming.